Good evening, everyone. It's so wonderful to see so many of you here in person, and of course also good evening to those of you who are joining us online. It's been a great pleasure to put this together and of course to welcome you all this evening to celebrate 4 decades of Armenian studies at the University of Michigan, as well as the very many accomplishments of the program's founder, our colleague and friend, Professor Ronald Grigor-Suni, the William Sewell Distinguished University Professor of History, as he is moving into retirement this year, although I have noticed he hates the word retirement. And I almost convinced him to stay on for another year, but I think Val convinced him in the opposite direction. And while we are coming together, of course, this evening to honor our colleague and acknowledge the 40th anniversary of the program, we do so in somewhat restricted form, as of course the dangers of the pandemic means that many of the more vulnerable members of our community cannot be present. And we're also coming together in times of war, the brutality of which I'm sure has deeply affected many of you here in the room personally. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Melanie Tanilian, and I'm the current director of the Center for Armenian Studies. Ah, okay, sure. There is a request. Okay. I will lead you through this evening. But before I begin, I would like to thank my co-conspirator, Valerie Kilvilson, also Alex McConnell, Reynold Hahamovich, and Albert Cavallaro, who have put together tomorrow's program as it focuses on Ron's contribution to Soviet and Russian history, a discussion that no doubt has taken new meaning as a certain autocrat is propagating his own version of history these days. I hope you will join us for that as well, and we will begin early in the morning, 9:30 a.m. In Weiser Hall, I believe, 1010 Weiser Hall. I would also like to thank Gregory Parker and especially Naira Tumanian, who I think has not slept in weeks, for their logistical help in putting this event together. Our co-sponsors for tonight and tomorrow include the Eisenberg Institute for Historical Studies, as well as Perspective Ensemble and the Jarvis and Constant Family Foundation's Daniel Doktorov Prize, the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, the Weiser Center for Europe and Eurasia, and of course, the History Department. This evening focuses on one of the many of Ron's institutional and intellectual accomplishments, the beginning of which brought him to the University of Michigan 40 years ago, and that's the Armenian Studies program. So I ask you to indulge me as I will recount some of the program's history here. It's an abbreviated version, so please excuse me in advance for recklessly omitting some facts and perhaps also innocent oversights. It's always a good start for a historian to begin with a date and then proceed chronologically. And I do this in a little bit of an abbreviated version, but for us the beginning is 1981. That is, of course, a notable year for many reasons. But for us, 1981 marked the year when Detroit entrepreneur Alex Manoogian had the foresight to fund the endowment of a professorship in modern Armenian history at the University of Michigan. Mr. Manoogian was assisted, and let's call it encouraged, by a group of local dedicated Michiganders who were deeply committed to the study of Armenian history, culture, and language. The group consisted of literary scholar Edmond Azarian, Michigan graduate Alice Haidosian, who unfortunately passed away last year, as well as the Dean of Pharmacy, Ara Paul, and the late Professor of Slavic Languages, Ben Stoltz. Ben, who many of you might have known, had invited Ron years earlier from Oberlin College to teach a course in modern Armenian history. And little did Ben know what would grow out of this temporary teaching assignment that he gave to Ron. And teaching Armenian history in the late 1970s, Ron will tell you, was not an easy task, as the materials available were generally more interested in national myth-making than historical science. A status quo that Ron has worked hard and with lots and lots of pushback from other scholars and the community to undo over the years. When Ron was appointed the first Alex Manoogian Chair for Modern History, there was little work. There was sort of little to work with. Armenian classes were small, and Armenian-related events tended to be sparsely attended. There was simply no program to speak of. But that seemed to be a minor hurdle, as Ron, in his pursuit to uninvent the nation, simply invented an Armenian studies program. So how does one do this? It takes 3 simple steps. And for those of you who are thinking of creating programs, this is instructional, so pay attention. First, you don't ask for permission. Never do that. And then you outline a course of study on a piece of paper. Inform of its existence is your 3rd step. So in Andersonian fashion, note that I just made Benedict Anderson Armenian. But kind of following this sort of Anderson's blueprint, Ron used the then super high-tech version of the printing press, the photocopier, that allowed for fast replication of an imaginary program. And this imaginary program was then, these photocopies were manually slipped into the paper course catalog for wide distribution among unsuspecting Michigan undergraduates. And the program existed after that. In its first years, the goal of the program, mostly directed at undergraduates, were modest. It was to encourage the study of the Armenian past, its present condition, the life of the diaspora, and the centuries-old culture of Armenians. Over the years, as courses were taught, festivals organized, the program grew, and one man's invention became a reality. Swayed by the program's activities and its success, the Manoogian Foundation invested into a second professorship in Armenian language and literature, which would be held by Kevork Bardakjian until only 2 years ago. And Bardakjian's vision for the program was to expand the library holdings, making the Armenian language collection at Michigan one of the largest in the diaspora. Many of the books in our library traveled at one point in Kevork's suitcase as he returned from Yerevan to Ann Arbor after spending the summers with Michigan students in Armenia as part of the program's Summer Language Institute, which he inaugurated in the late 1980s. Kevork's retirement 2 years ago opened the position, and we are hoping to announce the new chairholder in the very near future. So stay tuned for that news. At the time, in the 1980s, essentially, having 2 chairs in Armenian history, or in Armenian studies more generally, at one institution was simply pioneering, and eventually would then also lead to further expansion. Indeed, in the 90s and 2000s, the program grew exponentially with the mandate articulated by Alex and Marie Manoogian's children, Richard and Louise. Never directly intervening in the program, Louise and Richard Manoogian tasked Ron and Kevork to educate a new generation of scholars who would creatively and rigorously expand the field of Armenian studies. This mandate was taken on with incredible determination and energy by the subsequent chairholders and directors, and among them anthropologist Stephanie Platz, as well as historians Gerard Libaridian and Catherine Babayan. Gerard, besides initiating a major study of the state of the field, as well as an important oral history project, which he still is working on, although he's in retirement, and he made it his special mission to assure that the program would become a leading entity, really in mentoring both graduate students and early career scholars. In 2008, he instituted a yearly international graduate student workshop, which invites young scholars from Armenia to come to Ann Arbor and sort of collaborate and network with other students from across the globe. And one of the hallmarks, of course, of the Center for Armenian Studies is our Manoogian Postdoctoral Fellowship, which Gerard inaugurated in 2007. And with the help of the Manoogian Foundation, we have been able to offer this fellowship to about 2, sometimes even 3 early career scholars in Armenian studies ever since. The program has essentially a long tradition of being intellectually forward-looking, and its leadership has proven to be innovative at every turn. In 2000, Ron and Fatma Mükegöcek, who's here as well, joined also by Gerard Libraidian, initiated the Workshop for Armenian Turkish Scholarship, or WATS. WATS was met with great skepticism from many of the leading figures in the field at first, but pushing forward despite protest from senior colleagues, WATS, I would say, revolutionized the field of Armenian genocide studies. The Middle East Studies Association, never very keen on thinking about the Armenian genocide, awarded and recognized the significance of the work by awarding Ron and Müge its Academic Freedom Prize in 2005. Today, the workshop's legacy is undeniable, and the heterogeneity of our students and our postdocs, as well as the frequent visits and contributions of Turkish and Kurdish scholars to conversations at Michigan really attests to it. This collaboration was unimaginable 2 decades ago. Innovation has also been the hallmark of Catherine Babayan's leadership, her dedication to mentoring young scholars, and her interdisciplinary thinking and scholarship has had a great impact on the direction of the program's intellectual endeavors. For example, under her guidance, the program seeded the ideas and generated the support for 2 edited volumes, The Ottoman East in the 19th Century, and that was edited by our own graduates, Zovinar Dederian and Ali Sipahi, as well as a former Manoogian postdoctoral fellow Yasser Tolga-Kora, as well as the Armenian Mediterranean, which was edited by Michael Pfeiffer, too, a graduate of our program, and Babayan herself. Catherine is the one who has insisted that we need to think broadly and thematically. This meant, for many of us, to step out of the Armenian studies silo and to begin to ask what, for example, studies of the Mediterranean, translation, gender and sexuality, materiality, media and visuality could bring to Armenian studies, and more importantly, what could Armenian studies in turn contribute to these fields. A tradition that has been continued by the current chair of Modern Armenian History, Hakem Al-Rustum, who mentored our current Manoogian postdoc, Matthew Razarian and Helen Makhdumian, to lead a discussion exploring the fields of indigenous and settler colonial studies to think through Armenian history and literature. Graduates of the program and now the center have gone on to fill academic positions in major universities, and those taking courses have expanded the community's knowledge of and commitment to Armenian studies. I don't think I'm exaggerating when I say that Armenian studies at the University of Michigan has grown into the premier program, exploring the heritage of Armenians in our time. And we could have not done it without the leadership of our past chairs and directors, and the long, long list of individuals and families who have joined the Manoogians in supporting the work of the center. This evening is a reflection on Armenian transformations. Tonight's speakers will discuss how 40 years of Michigan Armenian studies looked at imperial collapse, ethnic war, and the rebirth of independence. From 1981 to the catastrophic defeat of the Armenian Republic in the Second Nagorno-Karabakh War last year, scholars at the university have been in the vanguard of examining and attempting to understand the experience of Armenians in modern times. When the chair was established, Armenia was a small Soviet republic, and half the world's Armenians lived in scattered diasporic communities. Within a decade, the Soviet Empire had disintegrated, and Armenia became an independent state surrounded by hostile neighbors. The Republic survived despite losses of population and economic distress. A thriving civil society defied the rule of oligarchs and self-serving politicians, as Ron writes, and in 2018, crowds marched to the capital to stage a democratic revolution. In the aftermath of the war, as they rebounded from the genocide more than 100 years ago, Armenians once again must deal with loss and find a path to renewal. Gerard Libaridian, who is joining us tonight from Yerevan, is super late there. Ronald, Grigor Soni, and Hakem El-Rostom, in what follows, will contextualize their work as chairs in modern Armenian history within these turbulent events of the last 4 decades. And with that, I would like to thank you all for your incredible dedication and work, and for having me be part of that. And I'm now going to turn it over to Catherine, who will lead us into that conversation by introducing Gerard.
Thank you, Melanie. Do you hear me? Because I'm short. Yeah? Okay. All right. Well, good evening to you all. And what an honor it is for me to be introducing, an honor and a challenge, I must say, to be introducing Gerard Libaridian tonight. Libaridian joined the University of Michigan in 2001 as the holder of the Alex Manoogian Chair in History and the director of the Armenian Studies program, after having served as a diplomat in Armenia of the 1990s. Armenia was a nascent nation state, and Libaridian did the critical policy work for its regional and international survival as he negotiated the Nagorno-Karabakh conflict and engaged in direct and at times secret negotiations with Turkey for the establishment of diplomatic relations. From the writing to the making of history, and then back to its teaching and writing, Libaridian's life experiences provided all of us, from his students to his colleagues, with a spectacular vantage point onto history and the implications of the past on the present. It is Libaridian's witnessing of nation building that has made our center an internationally renowned locus of Armenian studies, of course, erected on the foundation of, on the solid foundation of a rigorous curriculum offered by the 2 endowed chairs in Armenian studies, as you've heard from Melanie, the Alex Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History, which we are celebrating today, and the Marie Manoogian Chair in Armenian Language and Literature, which was established 6 years after. It is Libaridian who designed a multifaceted program of research with postdocs, visiting professors, training the graduate students, conferences, workshops, and he secured, of course, importantly, the financial support provided by Louise Simon and Alex and Marie Manoogian Foundations to fashion it. In this process, Libaridian, in his graceful manner, unbeknownst to me, was training me as his successor to direct the Armenian Studies program. I cannot begin to articulate the many lessons I learned from him about the savoir-faire, the ethics, and the diplomacy such an endeavor entails. The wide-ranging experience Libaridian brought to the classroom have similarly been treasured by his students. From his attention to reading documents, discerning words, reflecting on their creative ambiguities, his students remember his tenure as Alex Manoogian Professor in Armenian History in 2 interrelated ways. First, his courses on modern Armenian history were full of stories, characters, events, and analysis that one could not find much about in any book, because so much of it has yet to be written down and assessed. Together, these classes formed something approaching an underground alternate history of Armenia, an account that he was still stitching together, even in his own telling, and even as he invited students to elaborate upon his framing of events in their own way. Libaridian's manner of humanizing history, of stressing the importance of treating historical subjects as ordinary people, even the infamous Mofses Khorenatsi, who he would remark was, after all, at some point a 5-year-old child. And this should be considered when thinking of Khorenatsi as an epic historian. Second, and just as importantly, Libaridian's house was always open to everyone. This seemed normal at the time, but in retrospect was something extraordinary. It was a common sight to come by for dinner, find one group of emboldened undergraduates in charge of the grand ceremony of grilling kebab outside, another group prepping vegetables in the kitchen, grad students and faculty enjoying some fine scotch and even finer debate on contemporary Armenian politics in the living room, and whatever foolhardy person who was left over losing a game of tabla to his wife, Nora Nersessian. In this way, without knowing it at the time, Libaridian taught us all that the production of community and the production of knowledge are intimately knit together. Thank you, Girard, for teaching us how to be more human, fun-loving, and learned all at the same time. So please join me in welcoming Girard Libaridian from Yerevan.
Thank you very much, Catherine. Thank you, Melanie, and congratulations, Ron, on your worthy retirement. I hope you are going to have an award for many lifetimes of achievement. You have lived too many lives, most of them in history, but all of us will remember it. And congratulations, Kevork, for all the work you did for many years as director, in addition to your work as professor of language and history. Now, although this is a celebratory event, my topic will not be so celebratory. The title is A Republic, if you can keep it. I presume that many or most of you know that this was a sentence used by Benjamin Franklin after the US Constitutional Convention, where a lady asked him, what is the result of the convention? What kind of government are we going to have? And the response was, a republic, lady, if you can keep it. And this is the story of our third republic. And let me get to the heart of the problem. Some 30 years ago, the question was, can Armenia, at the time Soviet Armenia, be an independent state? And should Armenia be an independent state? Not everyone agreed that the answer should be yes, although those who opposed it at the time would refuse to remember that they opposed it. The opposition to independence had a simple argument. First step, being part of the Soviet Union offered security to Armenia. Second, Armenia would be invaded immediately and its population massacred by Turkey should it become independent. Because three, Turkey by nature is a genocidal state and Turks are a genocidal people, or something close to that. And therefore, obviously, security survival had a higher value than independence and democracy. And the threat to security and survival was real, and there was no other option than to accept submission to a stronger state and whatever that state imposed as a system of governance should be acceptable. As some of us will remember, during the 3 or so decades preceding that debate, the 1915 genocide and the campaign for its recognition had become the most important item on the Armenian agenda in the diaspora. Genocide and its recognition became principles that brought unity and legitimation of power, especially in diaspora communities, but also in its own way in Soviet Armenia. The study of the history of Armenians in the Ottoman Empire had certainly been tolerated after a while, if not encouraged in Soviet Armenia. When the ruling and only party in the Soviet state and its constituent republics lost its legitimacy, national histories began to replace party or political ideology as legitimation of power. In Soviet Armenia, national history was constructed in a manner as to legitimize fear of Turkey and make concomitant Soviet-Russian protection an essential component of any future. Thus, we should not have been surprised when in 1990, opposition to independence came from the two dominant political parties in Armenian life, the Communist Party in Soviet Armenia and the Dashnakchutun in the diaspora. The counter-argument to the no-independence point described above was that, one, a genocide in history does not mean a genocide in the future, that the genocide of 1915 was a historically explained and defined moment. Two, any threat coming from Turkey could be mitigated by a nice treaty with Russia, a strong defense, and a smart diplomacy. Three, the Soviet umbrella had not secured the lives of Armenians in Sumgait and the security of Armenians in Azerbaijan. And fourth, no other country could define and defend the interests of the Armenians better than its own citizens. It seems that after 30 years of actual independence, the question whether Armenia should and could be independent would have been settled. And yet, not only that is not the case, but we are also witnessing calls for an even stronger integration with Russia, economic and political, including a call from the first president of Garapal, who became the second president of Armenia, Robert Kocharyan, who is closely associated with the Dashnakchutun. He has called for a very, very strong integration of Armenia with Russia. The simple fact is that over the last 30 years, our statehood became weaker instead of becoming stronger. Weaknesses have been apparent for those who were willing to see and recognize for some time. But it was the 2020 war and now the Ukraine crisis that have exposed in such an evident manner those vulnerabilities. Today's Armenia is a defeated and humiliated state, negotiating with its neighbors with increased dependence on Russia, a protector that is mired in a devastating conflict. How did we become so weak and vulnerable after an initial promise of success? And why are some people answering the challenge to Armenia's sovereignty and perceived or real threats to its territorial integrity, even statehood, by calling for the total surrender of sovereignty? Let me offer some reflections on that subject. Number one, we failed to think and act as a state. Traditional thinking and value systems interfered, especially in the last 25 years, with our policymaking. And traditional and conventional value systems are characterized by two traits. One, extraterritorial national values. Second, colonial habits and frameworks. The political parties never really and fully committed themselves to a consensus once that took statehood and independence as ultimate values. Second, we failed to develop a strategy of consolidation of our statehood and institutions and values necessary for that consolidation. We were unable to manage the Karabakh conflict and allowed it to become a factor that at the end worked against our independence. Three, we thought that we could disregard the essential rule for a security of a state, that is, getting along with one's neighbors. While we ended up being fully engaged in the Karabakh conflict, we thought the solution was someone else's responsibility. At the end, we relied on distant and not so distant powers to solve our problems, and we assigned other countries in the world community roles that they never asked for nor wanted to play. Five, we failed to use diplomacy properly, and we often confused it with lobbying. We assigned our diplomats tasks that were impossible to achieve instead of asking them to seek what was possible to achieve. 6, we underestimated the real threat, Azerbaijan, after the victory in 1994, and exaggerated the less imminent and far less defined threat that Turkey represented. 7, we overestimated our strengths, including what the diaspora could do, and ignored the increasing capabilities of our problematic neighbors. We overestimated our strategic significance, ignoring the following facts. A, it is the region that has strategic significance. B, the region includes 2 other players, Azerbaijan and Georgia, that better positioned themselves to benefit from any significance the region had. And C, having strategic significance is not always a benediction, it could also become a bane. 9, the options domestic forces saw and adopted were foreign orientations internalized as our own choices. The Russian versus Western paradigm continued to dominate and distort foreign and security policy thinking. That paradigm, of course, came from the Cold War, but also followed what our historiography generally argued. Whether in its ideological label that was characteristic to the Soviet period, or its geopolitical dressing, security and political identity failed to formulate and follow a Armenian state-centered strategy. 10, to the extent that it was domesticated, the struggle was conditioned by the fear of Turkey, a fear that in its raw form was turned into strategic thinking. I would formulate it in the following way. We fear, therefore we have no choice. There could not have been a better way to foreclose debate and discussion and serious reflection. Fear was given the power to paralyze our thinking process, our ability to even see options. We have not yet come to terms with the following ridiculous paradox. On the one hand, we are so afraid of Turkey that we are willing to give up our independence, and yet on the other hand, we curse them every day, demand territories from them, and we don't want to or should not, and we should not talk to them accordingly. The question is often posed as existence versus independence. The thought that independence may be a valid path to existential security has not had much currency, at least in the case of the Third Republic, and maybe in more cases in our history than we suspect. Such a binary model can survive only if we omit from our history what we have done that should not have been done, and what we have not done that we should have done. The binary model works only if we decide that we do not count in history, that what our antagonists do and how they behave toward us may also depend on what we say and do does not occur. When was the last time anyone saw a treatise, an essay, an opinion, an op-ed by an Armenian official or strategic thinker that considers the impact of our actions during the First Karabakh War, when, regardless as to who's responsible for the militarization of the conflict, when we caused over 700,000 Azeris to leave their homes and become refugees, and then destroyed all of their habitat. As if we had not done that, or it was justified if we did it, but it doesn't mean anything to us. We don't mention it, but then we say Aliyev has a hateful speech. Apparently, we do not think that all of that does or should matter to anyone, including to the refugees and their leaders. And we do not think that threats to our independence can be reduced, mitigated, negotiated. You can only deal with it if you shut yourself up. Now, remember how Prime Minister Pashinyan explained his refusal to accept a compromise solution to the Karabakh conflict before the last war, and why he had refused an offer before and then during the war, the one that we lost and cost us so much, including another layer of independence. Pashinyan did not accept a compromise, he said, because he did not want to be called a traitor. And conventional traditional thinking that had dominated Armenia's political discourse had preferred war and the possible losses of war instead of the less costly ones through diplomacy and compromise. A leading nationalist historian just recently justified his support for the intellectuals' support for hardline positions similarly. He said he and other so-called intellectuals did not want to be called traitors, and that's why they did not. So they could not support a compromise, although it was those same intellectuals who chose to label those of us who favored compromise as defeatists and traitors. They taught the people that any compromise is treason, and then they complained that they might be called traitors if they supported compromise. Now, one fact associated with traitors is that they cannot hold power, or they should lose power if they have it. If a ruler is labeled a traitor, then he should lose, and I'm saying he because we haven't had the she's yet. That means Pashinyan did not want to risk losing power. It was not so different for Kocharyan and somewhat less for Serge Sargsyan. And the intellectuals, if labeled as traitors, could not help bring their own candidates to power who would shower them with gifts, as the Soviet state did, if they kowtowed to government. Power or its quest are related to the weakening of the state in another way. Other countries want a government in Armenia that is friendly to them. And many of our so-called leaders offer themselves as the ones who will perform that function to get that external support for their quest for or preservation of power. Therefore, it is not just foreign powers who will do everything to have their own men in power and thus weaken our sovereignty, but also men in Yerevan who position themselves in such a manner as to be able to be more acceptable to this or to the external power and have that power for themselves. That, it seems to me, is the way we become weaker and strengthen our and empower others. That, I'm sure, is the way we lost the Arshakuni dynasty and possibly the other dynasties. We can see it happening in front of our own eyes right now, while history may record that we lost our independence because of Russia or Turkey or Azerbaijan. Where have these traditional conventional thinking led us? We have at this point a clear threat to our sovereignty and independence, primarily from Russia, while most do not have the sense that the threat to our existence from Turkey and or Azerbaijan has diminished. How did we manage to find ourselves in such a bind? At least this time, we cannot blame external forces alone. Recently, I've been thinking about Moses Khorenatsi a lot, as Catherine mentioned, the 5th century Armenian historian chronicler. At the end of his History of Armenians, in the chapter known as I Mourn You, Land of Armenians, he blamed the fall of the Arshakuni kingdom on ambitious and self-serving princes, drunken generals, church leaders with loose morality and wrong value systems, and corrupt judges. While I personally do not share the degree of pessimism expressed nowadays regarding the future of the Armenian state, there is enough reason to be seriously concerned. No doubt Armenia is facing challenging moments, which I'm not sure it is ready to meet successfully. The least we can hope is that Armenia will, first, not come out of these trying times in a weaker situation than it is today, with the use of diplomacy, and then it may even be able to benefit from the few opportunities these fluid times offer. Thank you very much.
We are moving along counter chronology at this point. But I'm here to now introduce our current chair, Hakim Al-Rustam, who will speak to living in the future of the Armenian catastrophe. Hakim holds a PhD in anthropology from the London School of Economics, and he joined us from the American University in Cairo in 2016 as an assistant professor in history and the new Manoogian Chair in Modern Armenian History. Rustam in his work interrogates ruins of undocumented histories, silences, and memories as method for historical ethnographies and historical ethnographies in the aftermath of violence, more particularly. He's currently finishing a monograph titled Erased Lives, the ongoing denativization of Armenians in Turkey and France. And Hakem also convenes on campus the Global Theories of Critique initiative here at Michigan. And this is an initiative, a collaboration really between Michigan and the American University of Cairo, supported by the Andrew Mellon Foundation. And this initiative is quite exciting, seeks to create a community of thinkers and readers and practitioners to advance conversations between critical theory, decolonial writing, and critical indigenous studies. Hakem recently published an article, Internal Orientalism and the Nation-State Order, Turkey, Armenians, and the Writing of History, wherein he looks at Orientalist framing of Armenian genocide denial, and this is published in a review of international English literature, and the piece was part of a series of articles that examines the legacy of Edward Said's Orientalism 40 years onward. Hakem has been an important contributor to the Center of Armenian Studies, leading discussions and organizing workshops that push at the boundaries of the field. And it has been a great pleasure to see him at work these last 6 years and having him as a colleague. I could say many more things, but I think I'll just invite you to come and talk about futures and Armenian studies.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Melanie, for this kind and generous introduction. It's really an honor to be working with all of you in the Center of Armenian Studies and in the History Department. And I'm very delighted to be here today and honored to be in this sequence of speakers and in this prestigious genealogy of chairholders. Both Ron and Gerard have been mentors, colleagues, and friends, and continue to be generous in so many ways. I titled my intervention, Living in the Future of the Armenian Catastrophe. Let me take you back to January 2007. I was in the early stages in my field research on Armenians in France. Krikor, an Armenian friend from Istanbul that I met in Paris, told me that I must meet Hrant Dink, the prominent Armenian journalist in Istanbul, to get his perspective, critical that is, on the Armenian diaspora politics vis-a-vis genocide recognition. I wholeheartedly went to Istanbul. I was always looking for excuses to go to the city, as it is known in its Greek name. As I was meeting Salim, a common friend of both Dink and Krikor's, Salim received a phone call saying that Dink was just shot as he entered his office. We were some 200 meters away from Dink. Instead of meeting Dink, I ended up attending his funeral a few days later. This moment of violent death sparked the beginning that made me dedicate the following 15 years of my life to learn and write about the Armenian experience in the shadow of the catastrophe, the 1915-17 genocide. Dink himself was living in the future of the catastrophe. His murder was prompted by a historiographic intervention. Dink challenged standard Turkish narratives about Armenians and brought to the foreground the violence upon which the Republic was founded. In his assassination, Dink has political afterlives, where he sparked serious debate on the foundational violence upon which the Republic of Turkey was established, both politically and economically. Dink's life and work continue to be inspirational to me and many activists in the Armenian world and in Turkey. who are working for inclusion in their societies, not on the terms of genocidal and colonial states in Turkey or the Euro-American world, but for grounding the voices of political aspirations of dispossessed, marginalized, and displaced individuals and communities. During World War I, the Ottoman Armenian population was largely decimated through genocidal policies of mass annihilation, deportations, and death marches between 1915 and 1917. After the war ended, the wide majority of the survivors became refugees and continued living in exile. Forming diasporic communities around the globe, the nation-states that replaced empires gave homelands to millions while turning millions into refugees and minorities. Within the borders of what became Turkey after the Ottoman demise, as few as 70,000 Armenians officially became Turkish citizens, the wide majority of whom remained in Istanbul, and many fewer of whom, numbers unknown, remained in Anatolia. It is the latter ones, those who remained in Anatolia, that I have been tracing following Dink's assassination. It was my understanding, as well as the assumption of the majority of diaspora Armenians, that Armenians were either killed in the genocide or survived as refugees. There was systematic silence and even avoidance to acknowledge that Armenians remained within the borders of the perpetrator state. We never knew they existed. Even in historiography, Western Armenian history is mostly narrated in the linear sequence of empire, genocide, and diaspora, ignoring those who remain in Turkey. Armenian historiography takes the genocide as a finality, and Turkish historiography takes the War of Independence leading to the Republic as a beginning.
Okay, it says
While
that now
Turkish
I'm
and Armenian
attending, and the
historiographies have diverged
participants
in
can
many
hear.
ways in which they understand and interpret the significance of World War I, yet have converged in silencing the Armenian survivors in Turkey, thus distancing them from their histories and societies. We owe it partially to Dink's activism, life, but mostly death, that the knowledge about the histories and experiences of those who remained in Turkey started to appear. My intervention into these silences and absences has been to tell the story of the Armenian survival in their Anatolian homeland, on which the Turkish nationalists established the Republic of Turkey. I trace the genocide not in terms of what happened and who and what was lost, rather by its future, those who remained. The survivors who stayed in Anatolia after the genocide were labeled in Turkey as the leftovers of the sword, kılıç artığı, a derogatory expression that humiliates the survivors for not dying. This term, which was recently used by the Turkish president back in 2020, presents a paradox. Even though the Turkish state officially denies the genocide, the term indicates that violence has been committed against Armenians. The paradox of this expression connotes that Armenian survivor in Turkey is far from being totally absent. Rather, it rests in multiple silences. Silences that retells the story by either blaming the victim or rendering violence a war necessity. As an Armenian commentator in Istanbul recently said, boasting the murderer's murder harbors a new threat of massacre. In Turkey, Armenians continue to be seen as scrap, residue, surplus, waste, remnants, discarded and refuse, as the Turkish word for leftovers, artık, denotes. As the leftovers and refuse of Turkish society, the Armenians who continued living in their homelands as Turkish citizens went largely silenced in Turkish historiography. But it did not stop there. There has been a refusal to recognize Anatolian Armenianness by other Armenians in Istanbul and France. Within Turkey, Anatolian Armenians were also estranged upon their migration to Istanbul. Throughout the Republican history, the Armenian Church in Istanbul worked on bringing Anatolian Armenians to the city and sent them to Armenian schools there. From their perspective, as one Armenian puts it, the only way was to save the remnant. Remnant here referring to the Armenians who remained in Anatolia, was through education, saving the remnant by educating them. When speaking about the education of the Anatolians in Istanbul, the school and theological seminary of the Holy Cross, Surp Khach Tebrebank, is the center of the story. After World War I, the majority of the schools in Anatolia, as well as the theological seminary that trains clergy, were closed and destroyed. In 1951, the school of Surp Khach opened with the mandate of educating Anatolian Armenians as well as prepare those who choose to become clergy. Among the Armenians in Istanbul, it is widely known that the opening of the school was through the pressure exerted by the US government on the Turkish government during the Korean War, when Turkey supported the US military, which led to the admissions of Turkey into NATO in 1952. While the story of Tebrebank has been narrated as a success that led to an Armenian cultural renaissance in the city in the 1950s to the 1970s, such efforts of encouraging their migration out of their Anatolian locales came at a price. In his autobiographical novel, Tesbih Tennileri, or Prayer Beads, the Armenian novelist Migerdich Margosyan presents the perspective of some Anatolian Armenians about the school. When the representative of Patriarch Khachadurian arrived in Anatolia to recruit Armenian male students in Tebrevank, it was only open for male students, Margosyan presents the following reaction of one of the parents of potential students in his novel. Quote, "We have reverence to the commands of our respected patriarch because he is first and foremost our father, our spiritual leader, and therefore thinks for our best. However, we also wish to see our children grow up, get married, and form their own families, so that we can give them the names of our brothers, sisters, mothers, and fathers whom we lost during Kafle, so the fire of our hearts can be extinguished." It is notable that Margosyan was also the previous director of the school of Surp Khach and is a native of Diyarbakir. Throughout his writings, he articulates the rarely heard voices of Anatolian Armenians by writing his novels in local dialects of Armenian and Turkish, using a lot of Kurdish words as well. Using kafle, the Arabic word for caravan, is the local Armenian word for the genocide that tells us that the Armenians of the region experienced the genocide as death marches or caravans into the Syrian desert. Other places with other experiences use different local words to describe the catastrophe. And I also heard similar stories about the Armenian estrangement among Istanbul Armenians when Huri, an Armenian woman from the village of Sasun, immigrated to Istanbul. She felt estranged by Armenians of the city. I quote Huri, "In Istanbul, I live as a stranger to my own culture, and this culture is dying with me. My own heritage is dying. The Armenian dialect of Sasun too is being forgotten. Once there was an event here in the Armenian church hall, and I sang in Armenian. Then one of the organizers told the audience, 'Look at our girl, she came here with no knowledge of Armenian. Now she can sing in it.' Hearing this, I felt uncomfortable and replied back saying, 'I came to Istanbul with no knowledge of Turkish, but I did speak Armenian and Kurdish.' And the guy replied back to me saying, 'But your Sasun Armenian is not really Armenian.'" Armenian survival in Turkey was largely unaccepted by the Armenians in the diaspora as well. In mainstream representation in the diaspora, Armenians in Turkey were ignored and unnoticed on one hand, and regarded with suspicion as to why they continued living in the perpetrator state and society on the other. As a result, their Armenianness was denied by many in the Armenian diasporic world. When I first met Madame Shushan, who heads one of the Armenian culture centers in Paris, I asked for her help in meeting Armenians from Turkey. I had known that Armenians from Turkey send their children to local Armenian schools and cultural centers to learn Armenian and be integrated in the wider diasporic life. Shishan's first reaction, "There is nothing to know. I can tell you what you need to know." She went on explaining, "Those Turks come to France speaking only Turkish, watching Turkish television and soap operas, do not know or say anything about the genocide. A few weeks later, as two women entered the church speaking Turkish, a French Armenian woman had a fit with them, saying, 'We are here so as not to hear this language again.'" Shishan's criticism of recent Armenian migrants from Turkey, labeling them as Turks throughout our conversation, instead of the common reference for them in France as Armenians of Turkey, or Bolsa Hayr, like Istanbul Armenians, but for her, they were Turks. For Armenians who did not become refugees, Armenian survivors in Turkey became refuse of Turkish society and history, and were also refused recognition by the majority of Armenians in the diaspora and even Istanbul. Armenian history and experience outside of the Republic of Armenia since the genocide rests within the refugees, the refuse, and the refused. Each was produced in different contexts for different reasons, but they are all subjected to the gravity of the nation-state order, or shall we say disorder. Navigating the refuse and the refused meant that I needed to appeal to anthropological methods to answer historical questions, taking the silences in historiography and absence of an archive as starting points for writing between the cracks of history. By exploring the gaps and the void left in Armenian and Turkish historiographies and archives, I traced the lives of those who have been silenced, who are unwanted, and who are unclaimed by any nationalist project or nation state. For this, I coined the term denativization to describe the ongoing process of dispossession, erasure, and elimination experienced by Anatolian Armenians. Denativization is a process by which Armenians were turned into a foreign minority in Turkey, even while some continued to live in their native villages, cities, and lands. It is a process by which Armenians have been erased from historiography to serve nationalist narrative, by which their built environment and other physical traces have been and continue to be removed from the Anatolian landscape until this present day, and by which Armenians have lost or become estranged from their homelands, livelihood, traditions, histories, experiences, languages, and cultures. This process of denativization began prior to the Armenian genocide and continues to the present, for the catastrophe is ongoing. But historians, as writers, we invent our beginnings. And my story with Armenian history has yet another beginning. Not in archives and field sites, but something more intimate and personal. After all, the work we do is also autobiographical. I don't recall when I learned about the Armenian displacement, forced migration from Anatolia, but I also do not recall a time when I did not know about them. They were in the stories of my family and other Armenians we know in Cairo, Egypt. Borrowing Saadia Hartman's words, I too lived in the time of catastrophe by which I mean I am living in the future created by it. Words that best describe my own relationship to Armenian past. But what does it mean to live in the future of a catastrophe, be it slavery, genocide, or another violent event that turns thousands, sometimes millions, into what Hartman calls disposable lives? Such violence is inscribed on our bodies, and our biographies are scribbled by it. Living in Egypt, we knew that we came from somewhere else. Everyone knew of these events, and yet rarely mentioned them, because there wasn't much to talk about. We did not have any information about this exodus except that my maternal grandfather came from Mardin, they call it in Turkish. These words said nothing, but in their nothingness spoke of the violent ruptures that genocides inscribed on survivors, ruptures that leave survivors without kin estranged from their homeland and strangers everywhere they go, and often strangers to their own past. Our heritage is unspoken, to invoke the words used by Hari Harutyunyan to describe the ways in which his parents' silence about the genocide shaped his upbringing. Yet it was in France and among diaspora Armenians and among Armenians from Turkey that I became an Armenian from Mardin. The first time I heard, "I want you to meet our new friend Hakim, he comes from Mardin," I was shocked. I had never thought of myself as being from a place that I never visited. Although I knew the name Mardin, I couldn't even locate the city on a map, and it was not a place that I ever would have described myself as being from. This changed during the time I spent in Paris and Istanbul, tracing the stories of Armenians who survived in Anatolia, and at the same time tracing the Armenian in me. My non-Armenian three-quarters, if we can speak about them as in percentages, were mostly irrelevant by then, except that I remained an Arab among purist Armenians and definitely among Turks, which comes with its own Orientalist package. I have adopted the same outlook myself. Whenever I meet new Armenians, I now speak of Mardin as ours, as mine. We place ourselves and each other on a map of Ottoman Anatolia prior to the Armenian catastrophe, using the names of cities and villages that were used before their Turkification by the Republican regime. The homeland, cities, and villages that have been materially lost continue in their absence to inform our senses and emotions, and to shape our sense of belonging and the relationships they forge. Leslie Marmon Silko, a Native American writer whose people survived annihilation and dispossession, once noted that in Pueblo culture, to which she belongs, people constructed identities through storytelling. Using the present tense and the plural, "we come from Mardin," makes the statement always true and makes it speak of the present. Armenians speak of affiliation and belonging as articulated, experienced, communicated, and shared through stories. Such stories, Silko writes, are always bringing us together, keeping this whole together. When one Armenian tells another that they belong to the group of Armenians who come from this or that specific Anatolian locale, the listener reciprocates by telling their own from story. Through this exchange, they cumulatively create a larger story about a common origin and experience, despite the fact that they come from different Anatolian locales. It is in such differences that the common Armenian experience continue to be told. Storytelling in this context is not only about communicating facts and exchanging information. Storytelling, by forging meaning about one's present, past, and future, both individually and communally, is a path to survival, despite the loss and destruction that Armenians continue to bear. We all live in the future of the catastrophe. Thank you.
Greetings, friends. I thank Professor Melanie Tsanielian, Director of the Center for Armenian Studies, for this happy opportunity to introduce my dear old friend and colleague, Ronald Grigor Suni. Ron and I may have seen each other in 1966 in Yerevan, at the dorm at 52 Mashtots, where both of us then resided, he for 3 months while on a research trip from Colombia, and I as a student at Yerevan State University. Our first in-person meeting, though, took place in 1978, either at the Millet Conference at Princeton or at a conference also in 1978 that Ron had organized at Michigan, where he was spending a year as a visiting professor on loan from Oberlin College. He had already published his first monograph, The Baku Commune, a volume that highlighted the deadly conflict in Transcaucasia, focusing on the Baku Commune from about the mid-June to about the end of July 1918, its political actors, Bolshevik Russia, the British, the Ottoman Empire, and the three nationalities struggling for statehood in a nightmarish economic, political, cultural, and social conflagration. As it were, the conflict foreshadowed Ron's future interests. From the Baku tangled knot, he disentangled. He carried the threads of inquiry backwards into Imperial Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and Britain, and then, again in due course, forward into Soviet Russia and its three Soviet republics, Armenia, Georgia, and Azerbaijan, Nagorno-Karabakh, and soon into these new independent Transcaucasian republics, the Russian Federation, Turkey, Iran, the United States, and Europe. This is the amazingly wide radius of most of Ron's scholarly interests. I said most, for he has taught many various other courses on contemporary civilization, medieval and modern Europe, Marxism and history, empires and nations, autocracy and dictatorship from Muscovy to Stalinism, Imperial Russia, etc., etc. Ron's presence at the Millet Conference was an indication to me of his interest encompassing both the Slavic Russian and the Middle Eastern Ottoman camps, which few Armenian scholars have straddled or combined in recent times. Parenthetically, at Princeton, almost every participant from Bernard Lewis to Enver Ziya Karal sang the praises of the Ottoman Empire, and many, including the Turkish participants, headed by Kemal Karpat, nostalgically wished for its revival. I, at the time, dismissed this as an outlandish, if sickening, fancy. But reflecting on recent political pronouncements and developments, I reckon that Erdogan, then in his mid-20s, must have heard the call. 1981 was tragically sad for Ron and Armenia. They lost their little son, Grigor, in October of that year. Shortly after that, my wife Flora and I had a chance encounter with an inconsolably bereaved couple, Ron and Armenia, on the Watertown trolleybus in Cambridge. We met a few times afterward and maintained occasional contact. In that same year, Mr. Alex Manoogian endowed the Alex Manoogian Chair of Modern Armenian History at Michigan, and Ron was appointed its first holder. This was the start of a new phase in Ron's academic life, and he flourished teaching, conducting research, and leading the Armenian Studies program. He taught 2 Armenian Studies courses, a number of other courses such as History of the Soviet Union, Problems in the History and Historiography of Soviet Society, Ethnic Minorities and Nationality Policy in Tsarist Russia and the Soviet Union, Stalin and Stalinism, and so on. Concurrently, he launched the Armenian Studies program, which in fact he had initiated before joining UM. The 1978 conference, for instance, was part of such activity and programming. He organized conferences, local and international, with the scholars from the Soviet Union, like the late Galina Starovoitova, and Soviet Armenia, for example, Sergei Harambartsumyan, then rector of the Yerevan State University. We organized lectures, symposia, the Armenian Odyssey, a film festival such as the one for Act Atom Egoyan, whose star had just begun to rise. Musical events, most memorably the concerts of the world-renowned Chilingirian Quartet. He also organized an outreach program for the Armenian community of Detroit. He was active in the Society for Armenian Studies and numerous professional associations such as that for the advancement of Slavic studies, the American Historical Association, the American Political Science Association, and many, many others. He served on the editorial boards of many periodicals, Armenian and non-Armenian, evaluation committees, evaluator, prize committees, and in numerous other capacities. Ron then emphasized the need for critical mass for a wider impact for the ASP and promoted the idea of a chair for Armenian language and literature. This, chronologically second chair, named after Mrs. Marie Manoogian, was established in 1987, and this year marks its 35th anniversary. In the same year, the Summer Armenian Language Institute was launched, which offered instruction for almost quarter a century to students from Japan to the UK and down to Northern Africa. Then Ron initiated the Armenian-Turkish workshop with the purpose of promoting dialogue, understanding, and reconciliation through vigorous, objective scholarship. Ron then moved on to Chicago for 10 years, 1994-2014. I will skip his distinguished tenure to conclude my introduction. After his return to Michigan, as before, Ron continued to teach, conducted research, and engaged in academic activities worldwide. All this time, he had been publishing hundreds of articles, about 20 volumes, actually 20, some jointly with colleagues and some as editors. In the past decade or so, he jointly edited A Question of Genocide, wrote the book They Can Live in the Desert But Nowhere Else, and more recently, his long-awaited prize-winning volume on the Young Stalin. Ron on one occasion said that he is same великого армянского народа, but he spared no one, no Armenians, no Turks, no Greeks, no Russians, no one. He was strict, honest, and straightforward in his scholarship. And this very brief, incomplete sketch was meant to present Ron's humbling accomplishments as an extraordinary I can't read my handwriting, as an extraordinarily erudite scholar with astounding industry, a dynamic teacher and a solicitous mentor, a much sought after peripatetic lecturer, and, as you shall hear in a minute, a charming raconteur. Ron Suni.
Thank you, Kevok. Thank you, Melanie. Thank you, Nair. Thank you, everybody. Am I okay? Okay. There can be no identity without memory, albeit selective, no collective purpose without myth, and identity and purpose or destiny are necessary elements of the very concept of a nation. Stuart Hall. Armenians, as you must all be aware of by now, are a people who love to talk about themselves. That makes us not so very different from other nationalities, but somehow Armenians seem to take special pride, require a certain amount of attention, and look everywhere for confirmation about how unique we are, how particular, how extraordinary. And now you see how true that is. I like this story. An Armenian meets another Armenian on the streets of Paris, and he asks him, "Do you know who Napoleon's father is?" And the other Armenian says, "Really? I didn't know." Because Napoleon's father must have been Armenian. That only goes with Armenians, that joke. As an Armenian, I have partaken of this form of narcissism as much as anyone else, and yet, as a historian, I've tried to learn why Armenians have these feelings. Why do they think these things about themselves? How do they conceive of themselves as a chosen people? Maybe in part, it's because we are not very sure about who we are, where we came from, and what our culture actually is. Perhaps we actually share a profound unease, as you heard tonight, about our future as Armenians. We worry all the time about our children being Armenian. We have doubts, as Girard pointed out, about the security of the Armenians' own future. And why wouldn't a people like Armenians worry about these things? The long past of the Armenians has provided mixed lessons of people under constant threat. Threat from larger neighbors, yet able somehow to survive beyond and within rival populations. We are a people burdened, overburdened by history. A history, sadly, that many Armenians do not know very well themselves. And that not knowing also produces anxiety. We certainly know in some vague way the story of the Armenians as a people who effectively were removed from their traditional homeland, who then ceased for a long time to be of any interest to those who concentrated on the victors, the founders of the Turkish Republic and the Soviet Union. And therefore, we are a people whose history and suffering has been denied, avoided, rejected, and erased largely from the collective memory of much of the world. When I and Edmund Azadian and Alice Haidostyan and Ben Stoltz, of whom Melanie remembered, began in 1977 to talk about founding a Armenian Studies program with the entrepreneur and philanthropist Alex Manoogian, the state of Armenian studies, regrettably, was far weaker, poorer, and much more vulnerable than it is today. So we here, Melanie, Catherine, Hakem, we can take some pride that in these 40 years, the situation has improved enormously, and the University of Michigan and the scholars and the Manoogian Fellows can take some pride in precisely that. In other words, today, most Armenians know more about their past than they did when I was growing up. There are Armenian schools. There are various organizations. There's a huge publishing industry. I could read in a couple of weeks most of the works, serious works on Armenian history that were available easily in the library. And that's all changed. And finally, just after 100 years after the genocide, the United States of America, thanks to President Biden, recognized that the mass killings, deportations, and forced conversions of Armenians in 1915, 1916 do indeed unquestionably constitute a genocide. Now, Armenian history writing, along with literary studies and anthropology and other social sciences, is still in a relatively infant stage. Soviet and post-Soviet historians, those working particularly in the little Republic of Armenia, work sadly under the burden of unscientific traditions. I regrettably say Soviet Marxism is one of them, and now even more powerfully or equally powerfully, ethno-nationalism. In the West still, we have too few literary scholars, too few political scientists, Armenian and non-Armenian, who study our culture and state, sociologists, anthropologists, and so forth. And even the important subject of the Armenian genocide, so important for comparative study of that world historical crime, is underfunded and undermanned and womaned at the moment. So, I can report that the current state of Armenian studies at the moment is not in the same dire state as it was in the 1970s, but we're still at the beginning of building a firm, strong edifice of this important field of study. My mother told me, Ronald, don't ever get mixed up with the Armenians. They'll eat you alive. I didn't intend to get involved with the Armenians. I went into Russian studies, but before I knew it, I wrote about the Caucasus, as Gevorg mentioned, the Baku Commune. Then I wrote about Georgia, making of the Georgian nation. Thought, they're good, I'm out of that. And Armenians just came to me and said, why are you writing about Georgians? Write about Armenians. And eventually this chair came up, and I thought it's good to move from Ohio to Michigan. And so I came here, and as Melanie told that story, exposing me to the deans, I artificially created a program by slipping it into what we used to have, a paper catalog. Now, as long as Armenian history was conceived, as it was, and still is to a large extent, in largely national political terms, this story of a stateless, dispersed people that Hakim spoke about seemed of lesser importance. For long centuries, from the fall of the last Armenian kingdom, you're going to get a short course in Armenian history right now, in 1375, remember? And the genocide of 1915, the slate was largely blank. And even the tragedies of the 20th century remain unexplored by dispassionate analysis. Often directed toward an ethnic rather than a broader international or scholarly audience, Armenian historical and social scientific writing has been narrowly concerned with fostering a positive view of an endangered nationality. Popular writers and activist journalists, both in the diaspora and in the Armenian Republic, handed down what I would consider still an uncritical historical tradition, replete nicely with heroes and villains, and scholars who might have further enriched a national historiography, and I can testify this from some of our own students, withdrew from the field at certain times because it was marred by unexamined nationalism and narcissism. Threatened by ever-present enemies and official denialism by the Turkish government, certain kinds of inquiry were simply shunned as potential betrayals of the national cause. A critical scholarship, in other words, was seen by many as an unnecessary luxury for a small endangered people. I remember being told by a prominent Armenian scholar, Ronald, don't try to explain the genocide. By explaining it, you will rationalize it and you will justify it. And I said, Baba, I have to explain it. That's what we do as scholars. We try to explain things. Babam is Turkish for my father, just in case. People say that. As a people, scattered in dozens of countries and living in permanent danger of assimilation or acculturation, if not annihilation, the Armenians in the 19th and 20th century, and probably much further back, have all been long engaged in an unending discussion of what constitutes an Armenian. First, you have to find out who you are and see if that's worth saving. What is far less problematic for larger nations with their own state institutions has been central to the discourse of modern Armenians. What is Armenianness? Who is in the group? Who should be excluded? And we're very cavalier about excluding people often. You're only a quarter Armenian, enough. You know. So what is this if you don't practice the Christian faith? Are you still Armenian? What if you don't speak the language, which most Armenians actually in the diaspora don't speak? Is it a sense of history that you have? Is it some kind of national consciousness that we share? Or is it some kind of way of life? Is it a matter of shared values? Should we look for the answers to these questions in the received texts of Armenian literature or historiography? Is it only because we love Yalan Shidolma and Madzun in the morning and Lamahjun, all of which are claimed by neighboring peoples, the Georgians, the Turks, and everyone else? This question has been posed and reposed with part of the answer already known. When I ask many Armenians, like, what are Armenians? Why are you Armenian? They will generally tell you that they are essentially the same people who lived in Eastern Anatolia, and by the way, even that term is controversial. You don't call it Eastern Anatolia, you call it historic Armenia, right? And they've been there since the 6th century BCE. Armenians, they say proudly, are a people who have existed in one form or another for 2,600 years, not only in their putative homeland, but in countries around the globe. And for all that time, there has been a people called Armenian, Hai, in their own language, whose most enduring feature seems to be that in spite of countless adversities, they managed the singular feat of surviving with their language, church, and sense of nation intact. Now, it is undeniable that something survived, that there was, in a sense, a continuous linguistic, religious, and even physical existence of some people in that area and in the diaspora. But when we, as Armenians, concentrate on survival exclusively or primarily, we have often been led to unfortunate intellectual practices. Both historians and laymen have held that the Armenians have been guided in all times and places by a single ideological motivation, that of self-determination or freedom, or after 314, even that date is controversial, it's probably the actual date of the conversion of the Armenians, but we all say 303, okay? The traditional date. Preservation of some particular form of Christianity has been what we've been about. Heroes and villains are defined in that history in their relation to those fundamental goals, their loyalty to Armenianness, and for a long period of time, their loyalty to the church. The notion, I think, of a single explanatory formula for all of Armenian history, or a unifying theme or purpose that somehow links Urartians, who Armenians claim were ancestors, they're not connected to Armenians, to Tigran the great empire builder, or through the Bagratids, Cilicia, the genocide of 1915, Soviet Armenia, and now independent, beleaguered Armenia. The look for that single purpose, one suspects, is more a literary conceit than an accurate description of Armenia's complex, uneven, and fragmented history. When I was brought to the University of Michigan with the assignment of teaching a course in Armenian history, and I very loyally thought, I'll do that, right? So I tried to create this course. I found it a nearly impossible task because the history didn't hold together. There were long lacunae. There were different experiences. Armenians would be divided among themselves. The church was notoriously corrupt. And no one seemed to care about what I cared about, which was Soviet Armenia. So these themes of survival, freedom, keeping the faith, independence, were in fact closely tied to another unexamined assumption that there had been through all of this history, and I just wasn't finding it, an Armenian spirit, an immutable essence that had always characterized the Armenians. And this very constancy that makes up this Armenian nature, its punuchur, is a reading back, I began to feel, of the present national existence and consciousness into the whole past, as if it always existed. A unexamined, simple, historical teleology, the past leads to a foreordained present, the making of the modern Armenian nation. Luckily, just about the time I was sort of having trouble with all of this, a number of scholars, I'm happy to say many of them Marxists, in fact, Benedict Anderson, Eric Hobsbawm, okay, Ernest Gellner, who was anti-Marxist, but you know, you can't have it all, nobody's perfect. These scholars were saying that the nation, in fact, is a largely modern concept, an imagined community that is made not by some national spirit or essence, but by the active work of ordinary people, intellectuals, scholars, statesmen, romantic poets, all kinds of people. And together, that enterprise is what makes a nation. We're looking right now at the whole question of whether Ukraine is a nation or not. Some people, I won't mention any names, deny that it's a nation. But a nation, we were learning, and now has become, you don't have to tell your students this anymore. It was great value, remember this, when we could actually, sort of as a revelation that the nation is not natural, it's not just organic, it's not inevitable, it's actually a creation of human beings. They all know that now. Undergraduates know that now. I don't have much to say anymore. That's why I'm retired. So, but at the time, it was so exciting when you read, and by the way, those 3 books by Gellner, Hausbaum, and Denativization all came out in 1983. And were, in a sense, discovered, at least for me, here at the University of Michigan. Right? And many scholars were moving with that, my friend Jeff Ely, Roman Sporlock, and others. So there was another way to do Armenian history, and it had to do also with what scholars and others could teach, learn, research, put together in what precisely we were about to do at the Armenian Studies program here at the University of Michigan. Now, Armenians, like other chosen peoples, always set themselves against the Odar. We are an Indo-European people. We speak an Indo-European language. Odar is related to other. We set ourselves against the outside world, and we leave out the ways in which Armenians have been different at different times and different from one another even at the same time. That is the idea that Armenians can be understood, in fact, distinctly historically. And the divisions among Armenians, for instance, some preferred the Gregorian church. There were Westernizers who favored the Greek or Latin church. There were those who sided with the great Iranian kings or Rome against the local Armenian dynasty. There were alliances made between, let's say, the Bagratids, a great Armenian dynasty, which, by the way, traced its lineage back to David in the Old Testament. Right? We are the lost tribe. So all of these things, was made a much more complex and, I think, textured history. There were conflicts between different dynasties within and among Armenians themselves, some to this noble clan, some to an external power. So without much distortion, modern readers of the medieval histories of Armenian easily depict only the defenders of the Christian church as the national heroes, while those Armenians in the real world of those times might have sided with Iran, a powerful empire. They are traitors. One of those traitors is Vasak Suni. I don't think we're related. And I don't want to argue that my namesake, Vasak Suni, the villain in Yevishay's great history of the Armeno-Iranian wars of the 5th century, should be considered a national hero in the same sense as Vartan Mamikonian, the defender of the Armenian church against the attacks of the Sasanian king Yazgirt. Nevertheless, Vasak's actions had not yet come at that time to have the same valence that they would carry once the church was inextricably linked with the Armenian people. A more contextualized reading of the sacred events of 451, that's when we lost the Battle of Ayvarar, might note that in the feudal dynastic social system of 5th century Armenia, in which different noble houses moved back and forth between alliances with rival empires, the claims of a specifically Armenian versus Persian loyalty were far less imperative than they would become in the 19th and 20th centuries. So, an essentialist view of Armenians, that they're a people that have always and everywhere possessed a core of discernible, ethnically determined qualities, has been, of course, useful for political nationalists as the basis for their ideology. The continuous existence of the Armenians as a historic people, their origins in the Armenian plateau, with all the consequential claims to that territory, which is devoid of Armenians now because of the genocide, and is now contested by the Turkish state and the largely majority, which is now Kurdish. Somehow that essence still arms us with the right of self-determination, nationhood, and historically sanctified claims to any territories that we constitute as Armenian. And Armenians are a mobile population. So Cilicia, which is far from the center of Greater Armenia might also be claimed, and has at times been claimed. My view has always been, if Armenians could find a way to effectively govern their own homeland and republic that they have, and that they're in danger of losing periodically, then maybe we could convince others that we should also have some dominion somewhere else. Now, I'm not saying that nothing good can be said about essentialism, but perhaps we should think of it only as strategic essentialism. That's not my term, as you know. The propagation of an idea that Armenians today, yesterday, and in the future, okay, we're essentially a people that have similar goals, at least we think we are. Because there really is something that does bind Armenians, if they're at all paying attention to what Armenianness is, through time, space, through the centuries. And it's not an ethnic or political, or even I would say ideological in a narrow sense, essence, but it's rather a tradition. That is its subscription to the idea or ideas of what is Armenian. And it's a constant contest over what that might mean. You know, you don't have to tell this to Americans, because what is more fraught in America than the ongoing debate since 1776, or much earlier now, right, when the first slave ship landed in Virginia, of what America is. It's a constant contest, and quite a bitter one in our own country, here in America, fought on the battlefields of textbooks, on the battlefields of school board meetings right at the present time. So if a big, powerful, the most powerful country in the world that doesn't even know its own history is trying to figure out its own history and who they are, how could Armenians not also be involved in such a thing? I remember when I was trying to teach this course in Armenian history and trying to weave all these threads into some kind of coherent history, that I met resistance from some of my more, let's say, orthodox and religious students. I was telling the story of the conversion of the Armenians, and some of you will know that story. The great king Tugdat decided to throw a priest, Grigor, we call him Lusaborich, the enlightener, into a pit. That pit is now identified as Khorvira in what is now the Armenian state. And as a result of this, this terrible thing that he did to this Christian priest, King Tugdat turned into a wild boar. Some of you may know this story from other books, less important books, but it's there. So, now I claimed that this was a myth, not history. And there was a revolt on the class by several students. I don't think they went to the dean, but you never can tell. Because what had been written by the founders of the Armenian history tradition was fact, not fiction. History, not myth. I also remember the protest, Miguel, you may remember this, that erupted in my class when I invited a Turk, my colleague and collaborator, Fatma Migegücek, to lecture on the genocide. This was treason. This was bringing the enemy into the tent. After that, Miguel and I, friendly enemies, became collaborators in the fullest sense and carried out what several people have noted, the WATS, the Workshop on Armenian Turkish Scholarship, which brought together Turkish, Armenian, Kurdish, German, English, American scholars to talk about the genocide. And it was a hard road because many Armenian scholars would not come first to our meeting. We found some Turks, largely people who had been in jail and got out, but we found some Turks and a Kurd, a nice Kurd, but it was very hard to get Armenians at first. They said, first the Turks should recognize the genocide, then we'll have this discussion. I said, again, Baba, that's not what we do. First we have the discussion, and we'll see what happens. And of course, it was amazing what happened, and it changed that historiographical universe at the time. So Armenians can now, I think, very confidently say that we are a people that also, like other national historiographies, invent traditions, hold them sacred, and should always understand that this is a creative human process, not a natural evolution. It may be that our history is much more of a broken trail because for so long, from 1375 to 1918, there was no Armenian state, and many lost stories and traditions have to be recreated or replaced. Even nations like the English, whose traditions seem to have survived over long periods of time, and where archaic institutions appear still valid, in fact, have preserved their history, but not without loss and recreation. We know that memory is fallible, even in situations where state archives, state structures, official historians help preserve the written record. And we were not that privileged for many centuries to have that. The church gets some credit. Those institutions, those histories do survive. But then one large lacunae in the way people are still telling the history of Armenia is the 20th century. The 20th century is an unfortunate period because Armenia in the 20th century, from 1920 to 1991, was a republic in the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. And no one was studying it. One woman, Mary Matosian, wrote a wonderful early book on that subject. Very little else was ever written. And I went to Armenia, and I said, my goodness, there's actually an Armenia here. There's actually a university here, and there's a film studio here. And these people know more history, more books are being published than ever before. Now, the history of the Soviet Union, I need not tell Americans, is incredibly fraught history. And if you're a part of an empire, then the vicissitudes of that empire are also on your own skin. They're also your experiences. So Armenians went through World War I, just before this event. They were driven out of Turkey by the genocide. They suffered in the early republic, independent republic, from famine and disease. And then they were brought into the Soviet Union. And they began in that period, in again, a very, very mixed fashion, they began to develop their own Soviet Armenian culture. They went through Stalinism, collectivization, the great purges. The leaders of the country were murdered. The head of the Armenian church was assassinated. And then they emerged after the death of Stalin, and a very vibrant society, educated, literate, mobile. Armenians in the Soviet Union created their own diaspora throughout that whole Soviet space. And it was that people, out of that experience, that eventually made the independent republic that was formed in 1991. And yet that history has largely also been pushed aside. And it is now largely people who want to see somehow a continual Armenian tradition, except for that one difficult period. So I end with this thought. My thought is that history is not so much about falsifications. It's about what's left out. It's the empty holes, the blank spots, the lacunae. But here at Michigan, and in other Armenian studies programs around the world, our teachers and our young scholars are in fact trying in their own way, step by step, to fill those holes. Thank you.
Ron, for being here and your thoughts on Armenian identity. I'm not Armenian, but by now it might seem I also like to talk a lot. But I now welcome the perspective ensemble, and we are much behind in time, as in Armenian fashion. But Sato Moralian and Thomas Jennings, I invite you to come up to the stage, wherever they may be. Sato will say a few words of introduction herself, and I just want to say how happy I am to actually welcome you both here in Ann Arbor. We've been in touch for over 3 years now. It seems like an eternity. She's become a very good friend over Zoom and phone calls. And we have for the first time met in person today. Sato has been working diligently to preserve and bring to life Armenian music, and Armenian music that, as many of our speakers have said, also is part of this forgotten history. And she has been working very much to bring to life the music of Ron's grandfather, Grigor Suni, and Sato and Ron have been connecting over their projects to preserve the legacies of their grandfathers. Many of you know that Ron worked with his late wife Amina on the Suni project, which was to archive the music of Grigor Suni. And Sato, in the meantime, went on a journey to uncover her family's past, and in 2019 published a beautiful book on the life and legacy of her grandfather titled The Feast of Ashes, The Life and Art of David Ohanessian. And I'll pass over the microphone to you, Sato, to say a few words.
Thank you so much for that gracious, always gracious introduction. And we're not going to take a lot of your time, but I did want to say just a brief word before we play our very, very short program. I was, of course, extremely grateful to be asked to participate in some small way in the celebration of University of Michigan's storied Center for Armenian Studies, as it marks both the 40 years of scholarly study and the extraordinary accomplishments of Ronald Suni, who has contributed so richly to myriad historical, political, and philosophical fields, and whose expertise is greatly in demand at this turbulent moment in history. And it's wonderful to see so many foundational and rising scholars offer papers this weekend and add to this crucial stream of knowledge formation. So I wanted to thank Dr. Tanyelian and thank Program Coordinator Naira Tumanyan for their extreme patience and for extending this kind of invitation. And I also have to thank a few friends in Yerevan who helped out a lot. Artur Akshelian, who arranged two of the pieces that we're going to play, Sosi Mishoyan and Sati Bagdasaryan, who went to the Charans Museum in search of images of Suni. And we'll see some of these images as we're playing. I also want to thank the Jarvis and Constance Doctorow Family Foundation and their Danielle Doctorow Prize for their support. And I would like to thank Anush Suni, who helped a lot, Ronald Grigor Suni, and offer our great respect to your late wife, Armina Martirosyan, who brought her tremendous musical and scholarly energy to the Suni project and its recordings. So I was very honored to be asked to contribute in some small way, to attribute to the life and work of the composer, musicologist, and choral conductor Grigor Mirzayan Suni. So Suni was an enormously important figure in Armenian culture who deserves really much greater study and a robust revival of his works. And I'm happy to hear that this goal might be realized right here in the coming years. And there's a great deal of material to work with, including important volumes by Robert Atayan, Jakob Guyumchan, as well as a bilingual Armenian-English volume by Suni himself, which documents the long historical arc of Armenian music and also includes a detailed autobiography. This should be of interest to everyone, and it's available freely on Hathitrust. Other scholars, including Karine Van, have published articles on Suni, both for scholarly and general audiences. And in addition, the composer himself deposited a very rich collection of documents in the archive of the Charans Museum of Literature and Art in Yerevan, Armenia. So on your programs, you'll see that we've excerpted a very small part of Suni's biography from the texts produced in connection with one of the Suni Project's CDs. And from that very small excerpt, you will see immediately how much he moved around. So that in addition to his astoundingly fertile career as a composer and performing musician, we see that one of the most notable aspects of Suni's life was his mobility. And while some of his travels were related to his studies and his performances, other migrations were reflected in and were the result of the strength of his political convictions and his activism, which also pervaded his musical and intellectual life. In every place that Sunni lived and studied, from Shushi to St. Petersburg to Constantinople and Tiflis, Boston and Philadelphia, he eagerly learned from prevailing artistic trends, and he shared his own very significant knowledge of European classical composition and Armenian folk music. Sunni impressed many important composers, some with familiar names like Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov and Alexander Glazunov, and he introduced them to the vast song repertoire that he, along with Gomidas Svartabed, had collected in the field and subsequently published. Sunni synthesized new works, introducing Armenian folk themes into polyphonic settings and operatic forms, and he created many songs for the concert stage. He organized choral performances in pre- and post-imperial Russia, in pre- and post-imperial Ottoman lands, as well as across the United States, introducing thousands of listeners both to age-old Armenian traditions as well as his own newly composed works. And as musicologist Melissa Bilal said to me recently in conversation, each time a composer such as Sunni takes a folk melody and sets it for voice and piano or string quartet or orchestra, they are preserving it, but they are also creating a new work of art, a new chain in the living tradition of culture. For Sunni, this demonstrates his importance as a national composer. However, as we study his life and his interactions with other important cultural figures, his assimilation of circulating ideas and his dissemination of his own music through performances and publications, his prolific production of opera, operettas, choral, and symphonic forms that were so popular during his lifetime, we can also situate him as a globally important composer who should be remembered within the broad international scope of his contemporaries, of his global contemporaries, for the many facets of his very sizable body of work. So our very small offering this evening can really only give you the faintest hint of the richness and beauty of Sunni's works, but I hope it might inspire you to seek out the Sunni Project's recordings and to support the Center for Armenian Studies and its future research around the legacy of Grigor Mirzayan Sunni's life and cultural production. Thank you.
you.